So thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for organising, so Valentina and Antonio and members of the lab for actually creating such an interesting session event today. And I was very grateful for the talks by Natalie and Maria Grazia before, because they are perfect introductions for what I would like to talk about, because I'm going to be moving into what we kind of do with our voices in terms of the social context. And so I thought I'd start off by actually playing you a voice, and you can just start thinking about what are your immediate reactions to this voice? So what do you know about this voice when you listen to this voice? So I'll just play this, and hopefully, so somebody, maybe I'll just have Antonio as my little canary. So basically just to sort of scowl if things look wrong. So I'm going to play this voice to you, and you just think about your immediate responses. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to do that, but that was failing.
Well, when you go to your work in the morning, like 8 o'clock or whenever you start, you don't sort of go 8 o'clock and into it. You sort of relax and scratch your arse and read the paper and look out the window. Well, this is me at my work. This is me, I'm doing it. I'm not in a YOP scheme, this is what I do.
Okay, so immediately you would have some responses. Most of you, if I'd made you actually write down responses, I expect you would have gone for gender first and immediately gone for man, and possibly started thinking about a certain age of man. And because of the top down, because Valentina had introduced me in terms of working in Glaswegian, you think, oh, well, it's definitely English and it's Scottish English. And indeed it is Glasgow. And some of you, if you have some kind of knowledge, because you need community, insider knowledge to be able to parse and understand and identify, then you would know that this person is from Glasgow, so a Glasgow male, middle-aged male, and was recorded at a certain time. So this is actually a photograph of the main street in Glasgow in the 1980s, which is why it looks very dated. And the person is Billy Connolly. Now, some of you will have just simply short-circuited this because you would have known that it was that person. You would have known the celebrity and immediately accessed him as a person. But the thing that I wanted to talk about here is when we move from thinking about our speech production system to how that's actually used and reflects our social identities. So what I want to talk about today is what I'm going to mean by voice quality. So I'm moving from voice to voice quality. And I'm going to talk about what we think about voice quality and social meaning. So how voice quality indexes tells people about us and how we tell others about our social identities. And then because sociolinguistics has to work in a place, I'm going to take you into Glasgow, and then I'm going to show you how voice quality has actually changed over the 20th century within the context, which is important because it shows that unlike other aspects of voice, which might appear to be, if you like, we might not have control over them in some sense, voice quality is indexicality. That is, it's an arbitrary, conventionalized meaning. And those meanings can change over time. As societies change, so sounds and speech and voice quality can change. So that's my basic take home. So when I'm talking about voice, I'm shifting to voice quality, and I'm talking about this kind of definition. So for me, I mean voice quality in terms of the characteristics which are present more or less all the time someone is talking. It's a kind of quasi-permanent quality, and it runs through all of the speech sounds that issue from my mouth. And so voice quality is partly produced by the speaker, as was demonstrated by Natalie and Maria Grazia, but it's also a product of the listener, which is something that Jodie Kryman and colleagues have talked about as well. Now, I'm interested in a particular view of voice quality, which was proposed originally by Honigman, which looks at voice quality in a componential way. So it's a phonetic theory of voice quality, which regards voice quality as made up of articulatory settings. The idea being that as we speak, we hold our entire articulatory mechanism in various postures, from the larynx through to the supralaryngeal vocal tract, and that those settings basically will influence the acoustic production and will be visible articulatorily, and we can hear them. So as I'm talking, if you could basically, like, if you were looking at me, and you could do this with the television, you know, like watch a newscaster and then look at their lips and then see how they're talking, and you would be able to kind of draw a circle around their lips, and some people's lips will be like this and some people's lips will be like this, okay? And that's just a visible sign of one of the settings. Or some people's jaws will be like this. Or typically, for my variety of English, we've had lots about Prince Philip, who died just recently. You will have lots of people talking like that, and you'll immediately see. And actually, if you actually just look at it, I mean, as soon as you look at the photograph, you will know exactly what they're going to sound like. Okay, because their jaw is back and their lips are spread. And there's also laryngeal aspects. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about articulatory settings. So the articulatory settings relate to the larynx, and we call them laryngeal settings. They're the source settings that Natalie was talking about. And they importantly also refer to the supralarynx, the bit above the larynx, because that's where all the articulation is going on. And that's where the sound waves in the larynx are being modified and filtered. So we've got these different components and different types of settings, and we can analyze voice quality in different ways. So in the theory that I'm talking about, John Laver's theory of voice quality, he proposes using an auditory analysis scheme called the vocal protocol or profile analysis, the VPA, where what we do is we learn to listen componentially and break down the speech, the entire speech, into aspects of laryngeal settings. What's happening in terms of the voicing? Is it whispery? Is it creaky? Is it modal? And then we will also look at things like the supralaryngeal settings. So what's happening with the lips or the jaw or the tongue tip or blade or the tongue body. And we'll also think about the tension, the overall tension of the different articulators. And that will allow us to give responses about how voice qualities are similar and different. Phoneticians also do articulatory analysis, and these settings have been demonstrated in X-ray, ultrasound, and electromagnetic articulography studies, where basically people are tracking the settings of the vocal tract over the time of speech. And this is emerging work, but there's evidence for language and dialect specific settings. And very interestingly, fluent bilinguals use different settings for their two different languages. So the apparent fluency at least partly comes from the fact that they don't just speak the right segments and prosody, but they also speak with the right voice quality as well, or rather a different voice quality, an appropriate voice quality. Acoustic analysis is more tricky. So acoustic analysis is tricky because the larynx, acoustically, phonation, dominates the voice and dominates the acoustic signal. And it's not very surprising that most acoustic work on voice quality has really been done on larynx and laryngeal settings. And for many phoneticians, voice quality equals larynx equals something we call phonation. There's much less work on trying to understand how the configurations of the supralaryngeal vocal tract are reflected. But there is some work looking at how these relate to vocal tract resonances, and Natalie talked about these in terms of resonances or formants. So we can look at, so formants, by formants I mean if I have an acoustic record of speech, we see these dark bands, and these are the major resonances of speech, which Natalie talked about when she showed that nice triangle with the MRI configurations, and how the different tongue postures will look like for particular vowels, and then the output and the acoustic output for that. So much for voice quality then. What about how it relates to social meaning? So where does voice quality actually come from? Well, of course, we are all born with a structure, whether we like it or not. And that's a partly inherited organic physiological structure. We've got skulls, we've got muscular tissues and muscles, and it's not an accident that they come out the way they do. You can see familial resemblances. So there are organic and physiological factors in voice quality, and these tend to be pretty important when people are talking about the clinical aspects of voice quality. Because of course, if there are disorders, particularly physiological disorders, then that is going to relate in voice quality differences and characteristics. But I'm really interested in the habitual articulatory settings. And what I mean by that is, as a child, as an infant learns their language or their dialect, what's happening is they're also learning their articulatory settings. They're learning the appropriate voice quality for their community. And that process continues throughout their life. So this brings us to something which was discussed a little bit in terms of the high rising terminal and thinking about intonation types and how they are indexical or symbolic. They act as signs of social meaning. And this is, so the idea of social meaning and indexicality is that parts of the linguistic system are linked, act as indexes between parts of the social system, many different aspects of the social system. And voice quality indexes many different aspects about a speaker, from their physical and emotional state, which isn't actually just physiological, because there are cultural ways of coughing, smiling, laughing, all the aspects of language that we think aren't language are actually cultural and language specific. Our individual characteristics, including our age and our sex, and then our group membership. So the different social groups that we belong to, both macro, in terms of how people would regard us. I am a middle class, middle-aged, British, English, posh woman, and there I am at the macro. And then I've got the micro aspects of me, that I belong to lots of different societies, groups of people, in that I play music, I live in Scotland, I have teenage children, so therefore I have some access to young people and how they work and live, and of course I work with my students, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that what voice quality does is voice quality associates and indexes many different types of social meaning. Now, the research to date on voice quality and social meaning has largely been limited to the larynx, and that's partly because it's easy to analyze and easy to measure. So the measures that have been, the acoustic measures which have been devised in order to look at voice quality, work pretty well for sociolinguistic studies. So if we have a recording of speakers, then we can apply those measures, those acoustic measures, and get fairly good information about, for example, the degree of breathiness or the degree of creak, and so on. And there's a really nice comprehensive survey of voice quality work in sociolinguistics by Rob Podusfer and his student Kalye. If you want to look more into this, it's not just about English, although of course, sadly, most of the work on voice quality and social meaning has been on English, and I hope that will change. Maybe some of you might be excited and want to start thinking about working on voice quality in Italian or other languages, because the problem is that a lot of what's said about voice quality and a lot of these universals come from, guess what, the universal language of English, which of course we all know as linguists is a big problem for linguistics, because it utterly skews our view, and it skews our theoretical view of how we think and operate, which is a problem. Anyway, let me get off my little soapbox and go back into what I'm talking about. So we've got plenty of evidence, although I would say this is an emerging field. People have only just started really looking at this since the sort of, I don't know, maybe 90s, 2000s, looking at studies looking at a lot of interest in sex, gender, and laryngeal settings. Social class, not so much, but it's social backgrounds coming in there. And race has been interesting. And also smaller scale in terms of, for example, if people take a particular stance to what they're saying, they may fleetingly shift the voice qualities they're using. And actually, I really like Maria Grazia's Mrs. Thatcher's videos for that reason, because Of course, we all know, and as you pointed out so nicely, she lowered her voice through elocution. But at the same time, she also was taking a real stance in that second video to what she was talking about. And I think she was lowering even more because of what she was saying. So her voice quality was different because of the topic she was talking about. The more important and significant, the more gravitas, and literally the deeper the voice. And I mean, again, there's been some work on this, but this is a whole area to look at, and to see whether this would be cross-linguistic would be really very interesting. The key thing, though, is that voice quality and laryngeal settings are specific to their social context. And so this has created a bit of a minefield, because you can't say anything for sure about any particular laryngeal setting. So, for example, creaky voice like this is used more by men in the UK, but by women in California, more by Chicano gangsters in the US, but marry English speakers in New Zealand. So is it the case that they use different types of Greek? Maybe, we don't know. Or is it this thing that we see all the time in sociolinguistics and sociophonetics, which is that we have aspects of the phonetic and linguistic system which are repurposed, which gain particular relationships and indexical meanings in their context. So we have, if you like, we don't have an infinite set of resources in terms of speech. We have a set of resources, and those resources are deployed in order to construct and reflect social meaning. So it's not that surprising that the same features mean different things in different contexts, but it is a puzzle. And it's something that we need to know a lot more about. In England, or rather in the UK, there's been a kind of obsession with voice quality in the sense that I've talked about. And that's because John Laver's work in the early 70s was very influential for some of the subsequently quite influential sociolinguists and phoneticians, namely Peter Trudgill, who immediately got excited and went off and did a voice quality study of Norwich. John Esling, who now, of course, is a very distinguished phonetician of voice, did his first work and his PhD on voice quality in Edinburgh. And they were all very excited about thinking about voice quality. And Peter Trudgill even went as far as saying, perhaps voice quality is the single socially most significant feature of linguistic differentiation in Norwich, which is a very strong statement to make about something which isn't segmental. So if you were to think about sound changes and what you think, how you consider Peter Trudgill's work to be reported, nobody ever talks about the work he did on voice quality. And in fact, Labov himself, so William Labov, who did his Martha's Vineyard study way back in 1963, he too talked about the particular setting of the islanders. So actually there's a sort of theme running through sociolinguistics, but it's been a bit of a Cinderella. And the reason it's been a Cinderella is because it's hard. It's very difficult to analyze. Okay, so now I'm going to take you to Glasgow. And actually, Valentina was telling me yesterday that you have not very good weather in Italy. But I don't know, can you see the sun is shining on me here? It's sunny in Glasgow. Isn't that funny? It's not always sunny in Glasgow when it's rainy in Italy. Usually it's the other way around. So I'm going to tell you where Glasgow is, because I don't expect you all know where it is. It's in Scotland and it's still in the UK, but I don't know how long. And we have very sadly left Europe. And I'm in denial about that, obviously. So for those of you who want to see a map of the UK, Italy is obviously well off the scale here, but Glasgow's up here in the central belt of Scotland. And because I'm a sociolinguist, I have to tell you something about social context, because sociolinguistic change isn't just about linguistics change, it's about change in response to a context and how people live and work and function within a society. So I'm going to just go back and I'm just going to walk you through quite quickly aspects about Glasgow, which we're going to need to know in order to understand about what's happening with Glaswegian voice quality later on. So really the modern city of Glasgow was made by the digging out of the big river Clyde in the 1770s. And what that meant was that the big seafaring ships from America and from the Caribbean could come straight into the city of Glasgow and dock there. And as a result, the city's fortunes immediately changed for the better. And you can see we've got tobacco boats here. So I would like to just make a point here of saying that Glasgow's history is intimately linked with the slave trade. And so therefore it's very important, especially at the moment, to be very clear about where the wealth came from. So we're talking about a wealth and a development which is predicated or was predicated on the slave triangle. And that's something which we always have to think about now. Now, Glasgow, then, if we shift forward, I've given you a timeline here because this is going to be kind of useful. This timeline that I show you here from about the 1870s to about now, if you like. I should really have the 2020s, but I think I'm probably in denial about that too. We've got this timeline, and that gives us like the scope over which we can really think about Glaswegian. And I want to think about what's happened over that time, because if we look at the city here in the early 19th century, what we have is a city that was booming. So in 1890, Glasgow was the second city of the empire, not just of the UK, of the British Empire. It was magnificently wealthy, and it was extremely diverse, and you know, it was booming. It was huge and vibrant and rich. Now, what kept Glasgow going across the time of the wars was shipbuilding, because actually by about the 1900s and certainly by 1910, Glasgow was in a decline. And this happened to many Western cities at that time. But the wars were good for Glasgow because the wars required heavy industry. The war required shipbuilding, locomotives. And so Glasgow actually profited from both the First and the Second World War. But the industrial decline that had started actually became very substantial. And by the late 1950s, here you see a shipyard which is in decline even as early as 1957. We've got big decline. But Glasgow regenerated itself. And now, as you can see, it is sometimes sunny in Glasgow. And here is a dockland, which has been regenerated into, this happens to be an IMAX cinema and a science centre. But the point is we have urban regeneration. Now let's think a bit about Glasgow in terms of its space and its housing, because this is important too. Because how people live and are structured together is very important for how their language and their social networks work. So during the boom time, there was a great building in Glasgow, and Glasgow and Edinburgh are a bit unusual in the UK because our housing is very much like the kind of housing you might find in an Italian city. And that's because we have flats. In fact, I'm speaking to you from a flat. So whereas an English person would think that you would buy a house, Glaswegian and Edinburgh people, even quite, well-to-do people, live in flats. That would be a terrible thing for an English person. They wouldn't live in a flat, they live in a house. My mother still hasn't got over the fact that I live in a flat. She apologizes every time she tells somebody where I live. But there are these big tenement flats. So there was a huge building of flats, and in those flats there was very highly dense, the population was incredibly dense, and families lived together, extended families lived together. And a visitor in 1904 described Glasgow as the largest village in the world, this densely structured area. However, what happened was then Glasgow became associated with very poor living conditions and the Glasgow slums, because the high dense population, together with the incredible poverty of the tenants living in the buildings, meant slums on a very large scale. So the Glasgow City Corporation did something about this, and what they did was they demolished a very substantial part of the housing stock. So from the 50s to the 70s, large parts of the city were demolished, and the people living in those areas were scattered, were basically moved to the outskirts of the city. This happened in many other cities in the UK, and it also happened in some areas as well in Northern Europe. And it's called counter-urbanization, where basically cities implode and become you know, like a sort of donut. A very good example of this is happening in Detroit at the moment, where the center is basically pretty much derelict now, certain parts of the center. So these social networks that had been so strong were fragmented on an enormous scale. And this meant that where we had a norm enforcement mechanism, a way of maintaining local dialect and local norms, then they were scattered. And that means that two things happen. One, innovations can creep in. And two, what happened then was that in these peripheral inner city housing schemes, very deprived, there came a new thing. And that new thing is the social networks reform and become very tight, but there's ideologies that go along with them too, between the working class polarized against the middle class. So the working class who were moved by the middle class, and there's a really strong polarization there, and it's not a comfortable relationship. So the working class people are basically separating themselves from the middle class and vice versa. So in terms of external factors, Glasgow, of course, took part in the First World War, and there was inward and outward mobility. And of course, the media came in. Eventually, we had the radio. And so you get language coming into Glasgow and dialects other than those that we would expect. The Second World War, although people talk about it, it actually wasn't particularly significant for Glasgow because it didn't suffer a huge amount of damage, but it was significant socially because what happened, as in many other places, was that Glaswegians, and especially working class Glaswegians, left the city for the first time. And they left the city and then became, they then met people from other parts of the UK. And that meant that there was a lot of social mobility at that point. And finally, of course, the TV came along, and some work that I've done at earlier work has demonstrated that the TV has been quite influential in terms of how sound change has taken place. So one of the things that I've been interested in, and this is the context to the work that I'm talking about now, is if a city changes, so if the social environment changes, does the speech and the language change alongside that? So how are they related to each other? And if you think about it, we've got the boom here, and then we've got World War I, and then we've got World War II, and then we've got this urban redevelopment with the associated ideological shifts. And I've done quite a lot of work on this for a while, and my answer is, I think yes, I think they are related. So here I've got a number of, I've given you a word, and each word tells you about a segment or a sound that I've worked on. So I've looked at, for example, the production of R in words like car, or the production of L in well. I've looked at the vowel boot, or voice of aspiration and voicing, and things like perm, burr. I've looked at vowel duration patterns, as in bead and breathe. And I've looked at things like, do people say think or think, or people? They say brother, or lock, or loch, or wine, and so on. So there's quite good evidence for a lot of segmental change, and those segmental changes seem to relate. So you see changes are happening, and then, for example, this set of changes align with people who were born during and just after the First World War. And then this change is just after the Second World War. And then this package of changes all relate to this postmodern era after the regeneration and kind of part of a whole stylistic structure. So then my question is, well, what happened about voice quality? So that's what I'm going to show you now, is what happened. Because if you look at segments, you would think, oh yeah, segments can change, but what about voice qualities? And how did I do that? Well, I've been running a project called Sounds of the City, and you can find out about it here. And this project has finished, but it's still going on. Of course, I'm still analyzing the data. And one of the key things about the project was that I collected with my researchers a big corpus. And it's what I call a real-time corpus, because what I've done is we found as many recordings as we could from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. So we've got recordings across the decades. We've got some for the 2021s now as well. And then we also had a structure which allowed us to look at old, middle-aged, and younger speakers. And we did this for a reason. We did this because we're working with a particular view of how language is acquired and how we can tell information about language from people of different ages and different times. So what I've done is shown you the time depth of the Glasgow corpora, now aligned with our timeline. So here in the grey are the periods of the recordings. You might wonder why there aren't recordings before the 1970s. That's because Glaswegian dialect was very stigmatized, and it wasn't actually represented on the BBC or on the radio at all. I did manage to find some very interesting recordings from the early period, from the First World War actually, but they don't give me any help for voice quality. So I'm not going to talk about it just now, okay? Now, the way that we work as sociolinguists is there is this assumption, which is quite a good assumption, that we acquire our language, our speech and language, pretty much entirely, our phonetic system, by the age of about 7 or 8. And then, of course, there is flexibility over our lifespan, but many aspects and systematic aspects of our speech basically will travel with us throughout our life. So if you talk to somebody who's in their 80s, then what you're doing is listening to the speech of somebody of when they were 10, so 70 years ago. Okay, this is called the apparent time hypothesis and was put forward by Lebov and largely works. So I'm not trying to say that speech isn't flexible, because it is, and it's much more complicated than I've expressed, but basically this mainly works. And that's why when we speak to older speakers, they sound old-fashioned. They do sound old-fashioned. They are old-fashioned. They are speaking with systems which are different from our systems, which are earlier systems. So we've got people who can tell us right back here, so they were children then, at the turn of the century. And then we've got people who were children, the middle-aged people who were children around the Second World War, and then people who were born and who were children and acquired their language in the urban regeneration period. So now let's see what's actually happened. So when I started working on voice quality in Glasgow, this is the first thing I ever did when I came to Glasgow. Okay, and so this was back in 1997, and I was asked to write a chapter on Glaswegian, and there I was. I just turned up in Glasgow speaking like this, which is actually quite hard in Glasgow because there's quite a lot of hostility to an accent like mine. It's, you know, very posh Southern English person. In fact, some of the children I worked with thought I was so posh that I was from Edinburgh. They didn't even know I was from England. Okay. But there you go. And I was set the task of having to work on Glaswegian. So I thought, okay, fine, I'll work with my students. In fact, now I am still working with some of those students today. So Eleanor Lawson was my student in 1997, and she's still my colleague today, which is quite nice. There you go. But I was looking for the stereotypical Glasgow voice. And that stereotypical Glasgow voice quality is sort of harsh, with a sort of slack articulation. So I'm giving you a sort of type of, and it's associated actually with aggression. Going back to what Maria Grazia was talking about, Glaswegian voice is associated with aggression. And actually, people like me, actually, when I first came to Glasgow, I was pretty scared. I was walking around Glasgow listening to ordinary Glaswegians talking, and I was alarmed by them. And I didn't realize that they were fine. They were happy. They were just talking like Glaswegians. It was all right, because for me, the indexicality of harshness is aggression. It's not how you speak. It's not just a norm. And Billy Connolly has some good examples of that, although I didn't give you a particularly harsh, I didn't give you a very stereotypical view of him, and we'll see why in a minute. So I have two questions. The first is, what is it like? And the second is, has it changed? So my samples, I had two samples. The first sample for what's Glasgow voice quality like. In 1999, which was work where I collected data actually in 97, I had some recordings from 32 speakers that was made in 97, and they were from people who were born in the 40s and born in the 80s. And so I've got males and females, working class, middle class speakers, one time point, and they were reading, they had read word lists and spontaneous speech. And my analysis was a detailed auditory analysis using the VPA, the vocal profile analysis system, which I had been trained to use. And what did I find? So what I found was this: Glasgow or Glaswegian doesn't just have one voice quality. Glaswegian has lots of voice qualities, and those voice qualities are stratified socially by age, by gender, and by social class. And when I say they're stratified by age and gender, that doesn't mean just the physiological age. I'm talking social age and social gender, okay? So the other thing I found was there was very little evidence for the stereotypical Glasgow voice. And I was working with Glaswegian working class men, and I was really confused because I didn't find what I had expected to find. I did find that working class speakers had a whispery voice. They had the advanced tip tongue blade. They had some tongue root traction, but it was more sort of as opposed to okay? So more than which was what I was expecting in terms of tongue body. And the younger speakers in particular had this kind of voice quality. And I want to show you, and I did actually manage to find an example, which means that Valentina doesn't have to do any editing later, because I was delighted to see that this kind of voice quality is stereotyped now so much that it's comedic. Now, don't worry if you don't understand all of this. Nobody can understand all of this. That's the point. Just see how you get on. I'm going to try and play it now. I'm going to try and put it to full screen.
Full name?
Colin Bell.
Sorry, what?
I'll just try that again.
I say to you, Colin.
Full name?
Colin Bell.
Sorry, what?
I say to you, Colin Bell.
I'm getting...
Colin Bell.
Do you manage to get his first name?
Colin
Colin Bear?
Bell?
No.
Oh, say that, man. Say that, man. Yeah, well, say that, man.
Let's just go with Colin for now. Riverside Warehouse on the 19th of March. Can I just ask, first of all, what you were doing there?
I say to you, I've been through this, right? I wasn't even met Bell, right? I was a starter. I mean, only met Bell on Saturday, right? But Big Cubby was a shout, right?
This was like high-level BAM talk. It was full-on.
What's that? Says I thought, well, there's maybe some
I'm
work
so
there.
sorry, I'm so sorry.
There's maybe work there.
I'm going to need to stop you. Can we just start just a little bit so I'm literally focusing right in on those lips, right?
Right, so here's the thing, right? Tell me, I just every so often I can make it. I mean, Saturday's most of the time, and maybe dug it.
I tried blinking, I tried writing it down, I tried charades. At one point I even got him to draw, you know, like a picture, like they do in Art Attack, but unfortunately I couldn't get any further. With a wee bit, yeah.
I looked totally rattled, wasn't I?
Absolutely, I'm sweating buckets.
It was pretty difficult even for me, and I'm used to doing it all the time. I'm used to the BAM talk. Right, it's okay. So what's his name? Let's get started.
Colin Bell.
Colin Bertram. Age?
No, it's kind of like
25, smashing.
There is a wee bit of reputation that goes around the station. She is called the BAM Whisperer.
It's like a sixth sense almost. And who else could you give us the name of the accomplices?
Big Cubby uses the what? Big Marco.
Oh, Big Marco.
How you get there?
It's just... It's his bra.
It's his bra.
It's his bra.
It's his bra.
It's bra. Do that. Bra.
We learn the lingo. It's like when you go to Spain on holiday. You do a wee bit of homework, you learn a wee bit of the local lingo, you know, your gracias, your buenos noches. So we learn the Scottish chat. Alright, Droops, what's happening? And when they start to bam us up, we just bang them up.
Okay, so I think you really get the point there. And the reason that I like that so much is because now it's basically stereotyped to the extent that an actor can do it. And the whole point about that is you have the separation of the two voice qualities, the women with their middle class voice quality and the BAM, which stands for BAM pot, which means sort of, you know, sort of urban delinquenty, stupid person, producing this really velarized voice. And I love the way that the BAM whisperer says, oh, so she has to produce the velarized tongue body setting in order to produce what he's doing. So then my second question, if we've got, you know, we've got really strongly velarized voice here, and then we've got Billy sounding a bit different, more stereotypical there, then I was wondering, well, what's happened over the time? And don't worry, guys, I'm going to keep to time because we're getting there, I know. So then what I did was I looked together with my colleague Martin Soskathy, we then looked at right early on to look at the speakers who were the oldest speakers in our sample to see, well, what's language like and what's voice quality like in the turn of the century. So did something change at that point? So we've got 4 time points, 24 speakers, spontaneous speech. And this time we did 2 types of analysis. I did an auditory VPA analysis and I did an acoustic analysis. And what I found was, even at that very early point, I found evidence to show that the voice quality is changing even then. So it had started to change even then. And I'm just giving you the result for tongue body height. So that's the articulatory setting of tongue body height, which basically becomes more raised the later the decade of birth. So it's least raised in those born in the 1890s and most raised in the 1920s. And I felt that, given I'd always shown you men, I'll just give you a little sample speaker. So here's a speaker, an elderly woman born in the 1890s. Sorry.
And then there used to be a great big shop at the corner of the arcade in Glasgow, and they bred Clydesdale horses. Well, they came about the house.
So that's what she sounds like, and I didn't really hear, we didn't hear her tongue body as being particularly high. In fact, it's actually low. So what we're seeing here, I should have said, just oriented you here. So every line is a person, and then this is the mean for those 6 speakers for their decade of birth. And if they're 0, it was felt to be neutral. And if it's below the line, it was felt to be lowered. And if it's above the line, then it's felt to be raised. And what you can see is that gradually the mean raises over time. And here's somebody who was born in the 1920s, a woman born in the 1920s. Oops, sorry, bit sensitive.
Dollar Ray was there at one time.
Right.
Because they had that full building. And then there was the Pakistan shop, and then there was, but I do remember Dollar Ray was there and that Pakistan shop.
So you've got a very different overall quality, from a sort of R type quality to an type quality. And that's even at a very early stage. And when we did the acoustic analysis, we measured all of the vowels, all of the monophthongs from these speakers, everything. And then we looked at the major resonance for the 3rd major resonance, the 3rd formant. And we find here that, can you see that there is basically an increase in the 3rd formant for both females and male speakers? And this is a significant increase, and it marches in step across the decades of birth. And this is correlated with the auditory tongue body height setting that I'd heard. And it is consistent with uvularized voice, if we were to say, look at what Gunnar Fant would argue in terms of constriction, where the constriction is and what we expect to be happening. So not so much velarized, but more, the constriction seems to be more in the uvular area to account for the raising of this 3rd formant. So I just want to now just basically walk us through what's actually happened, because this shows, I think, how voice quality is not is arbitrary and is associated with social meanings, and how things can change over time. So we started at this point with Glasgow, a city booming, rich, bustling, with huge mobility, with the ships coming in from Liverpool and America right into the center of the city. Okay, so we've got pictures like this. We've basically got the center of the city is full of people. And what I'm interested in, and started to realize when I was giving talks about Glaswegian, people around England said, this sounds like Liverpudlian, this sounds like Liverpool. And then I started looking at the shipping routes and the relationships. And of course, who's the apart from New York and Montreal, who's the major partner with Glasgow in the 1870s, 1880s? It's Liverpool. And it's Northern Ireland. So basically what we've got is this Liverpudlian shift, and Liverpudlian has a raised tongue body. So we think of Liverpool as Liverpool. People in Liverpool talk like that. Okay, come from Liverpool, you right? You're right. Sorry, terrible. Apologies to any Liverpudlian who listens to this now or in future on YouTube. I know you don't really talk like that, but it's the raised tongue body, okay? Velarized. So that seems to have sort of got into the system and seems to have been, and it's associated with working class people, because who was unloading the ships? It wasn't the shipping magnates. It was the ordinary working class people were in direct contact with. There was huge direct contact, but it sort of probably trotted along here. So we don't know if anything really happened. But then, and Lebov points this out, and this is a really important part of understanding how sound change works, and in particular how variation becomes sound change. So we know there's variation all the time in the linguistic system. How does a variant become a sound change? Variants become sound changes when, for reasons that we don't fully understand, they become associated with particular social meanings and particular groups of people. And then we get a reciprocal process, and it's just like a trigger. So as soon as we get a relationship, and in this case, velarized, euvelarized voice became associated with urban toughness, working class, anti-establishment, and then it takes off. And in fact, it takes off so much that by 2017 and that comedy, it's now utterly stereotypical. So it has gone through Lebov's process from being a marker to an indicator to now a stereotype. It's absolutely gone through the whole system because it's now part of a persona. And these changes in voice quality appear to show very similar trajectories to segments. They arrive through, innovations arrive through dialect contact, they develop social meaning, and then they take off, associated with ideology. And we've also discovered, and this is interesting for those of you who like working on segments, the voice quality affects segmental change too. But that's a completely different story. So I'm going to stop because my time is definitely up. And just to say that, just a point to another project I'm working on now, the SPADE project, which is looking at speech across dialects of English. We've now got a massive corpus, which I'd love to point you to if you want to work on any aspects of English. We've got huge amounts of data, which you can plunder and use. But we can think about start looking at voice quality acoustically across time and space in a big way. But thank you so much. And yes, I'm looking forward to your questions and discussion.